Apple is known for its successful line of smartphones, the iPhone, and I don't think we have to talk much on their history, how far they've come in the last decade, or how crazy good the quality of their built-in camera systems have become. But more than a decade before that infamous announcement by Steve Jobs on June 29, 2007, Apple ventured into the digital imaging space with one of its first consumer digital cameras, the Apple Quicktake 100. What happened to this camera from the past, and how did Apple quietly memorialize this device inside the iPhone? Join us in uncovering the story of one of the world's most obscure cameras. The 90s were a very challenging time for Apple as a company. After Apple fired Steve Jobs in 1985, or he just left. Depends on which story you believe. But after Steve Jobs had left or had been fired, Apple had some quick success in the late 80s to the early 90s with the introduction of the System 7 operating system that brought color to the Mac for the first time.
System 7 is the new system software for the Macintosh. But why should an organization upgrade its users to System 7? And how should you manage that transition?
But that bout of success would not last long as Apple's leadership brought the company through a rebrand and started developing beyond bizarre products in the 90s. With products like the Apple gaming console, Pippin. The Apple PowerCD.
The PowerCD is 3 products in one: a photo CD player for your television, a portable CD-ROM drive for your personal computer, and an audio CD player.
The Apple Message Pad.
We're in the middle of the most boring meeting in the history of Western civilization. Joe checked out an hour ago dreaming of fields of clover and a girl named Cindy. Suddenly his boss asks him how many feet of zinc tubing we have in stock. I could let him hang, but instead I send him the answer. Newton communicates.
Yeah, this era of Apple's history could be defined as absolute desperation, searching for something that would help them out of the financial hole they were in. Their products had become overpriced and almost obsolete, as they had barely innovated on any of their previous products and were no longer considered a technological leader in the industry. In fact, they were the butt of many jokes in the industry. With all of that backstory and history in mind, this finally takes us to the one other odd product they developed in the 90s, the Apple Quicktake in 1994.
Before, after. Before, after. Before, after. How do you get from before to after? Simple. Introducing the Apple Quicktake digital camera. It makes everything you do look better than before.
This camera is considered to be one of the first consumer digital camera lines and was a bit of a strange direction for Apple, as up to this point, the company had zero experience with cameras or photography in general. Despite this, Apple started development on this camera in 1992, codenaming it Venus, probably seeing potential in a booming market in the US at that time that would spend $12 billion annually on photography equipment. Quick way to make money, I'm sure they thought. Apple would search for a company that they could partner with and found one in none other than Kodak, who had been developing sensor tech for digital cameras since the mid-1970s with their CCD sensors. Apple would go on to partner with Kodak to get their take on their camera they had been developing, and Kodak in turn would help to add a CCD sensor to the camera for its final design. Apple would unveil it for the first time at Tokyo Macworld on February 17, 1994, and would go on to release it for sale in June of that year, costing around $749 or around $1,300 today, if we calculate in the inflation. Early reviews on it were positive, winning a Product Design Award in 1995 and being lauded as being fairly accessible to consumers. But what was inside this camera, and what are the interesting specs from a digital camera in the 1990s? Well, they would make 2 separate models, one for Windows and one for Mac. The internals of both were identical, just with the ability to connect to different operating systems. Its sensor is believed to be a version of the Kodak CCD sensor DCS-100. It could shoot 8 photos photos at 640 by 480 resolution with 24-bit color, and had an internal storage of 1 megabyte that you couldn't delete the photos from unless you connected it to the computer. It had a fixed focal length that was comparable to a 50mm lens on a 35mm camera, an ISO of 85, and an aperture range of 2.8 to f/16. It's kind of an odd boxy shape too that some commented looked like something out of Star Trek, and nothing like an actual camera. It had an optical viewfinder that many found quite hard to actually look through, a built-in flash that was said to make people appear ghostly white if used, and it ran off of 3 AA batteries. Oddly enough, this camera just never shuts off unless you actually remove the batteries. Both of these models were sold with serial cables to be able to attach to a computer and transfer files. The pictures were taken in Apple's proprietary QuickTake format and had to be exported to PICT files through their QuickTake software. So it was a bit annoying to get files off of this. In fact, in an article from MacSales.com, Steve Sandy, who remembers the first interaction he had with this camera at the Apple Worldwide Developers Conference in 1994, recalled how slow this transfer speed was, saying, "Apple and one of the magazines at the time had set up a booth where they could take your photo with the QuickTake 100, then mock up a personalized magazine cover. Great idea, but in execution, it was horrible. Downloading the camera's images to a Mac over a serial cable was dreadfully slow. So moving 30 to 320 by 240 images to the Mac took a long time. Next, an Apple employee had to mock up the magazine cover and print it out on a QMS Color Script Laser 1000, which was also quite slow. Needless to say, only a relative handful of the attendees actually got one of the mock magazine covers. After releasing this camera, they would go on to release only 2 other models through 1997, the QuickTake 150 and the QuickTake 200 that was built by Fujifilm instead of Kodak. Out of all the models, the QuickTake 200 was probably the most desired as it looked more like a camera, added an LCD to preview the photos you took, as well as utilizing a 2 megabyte smart media flash RAM card that was removable. Also, it was able to take video, had added aperture controls, and had 3 separate lens modes, but it still had the same resolution at 640 by 480 as the previous 2 QuickTake cameras. The images out of these cameras were nothing to write home about, but back in the 90s, it was a glimpse into the future of what was to come. We actually managed to get our hands on the QuickTake 150 for this video and can attest to how impossible it really is to get photos off of these cameras with software and computers that barely exist anymore. Even the craziest Mac nerds have had issues trying to get files off of these cameras. Even back then, they had several reports of the computer not even being able to recognize the camera half of the time when they plugged it in. We really did try to pull some photos we took off of the camera, but ran into countless technical issues and just never found the correct software to make it work. But we were able to find some video and photos from these cameras across the internet that we've included throughout this video. The cumbersome aspect of this camera is what would partially lead to its eventual discontinuation. Around 1996 to 1997, other companies like Kodak, Fujifilm, Canon, and Nikon started getting into the digital photography game as well. And with their vast experience with cameras and being an already trusted name in the camera industry, Apple really had no shot to win over consumers and instead relegated sales for their cameras to the education and small business markets. Around this time though, Apple would acquire the company Next, a computer company founded by none other than Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs would eventually force a much needed transfer of power, becoming the CEO of Apple in 1997. Steve Jobs would quickly put a stop to all of the random Apple products being developed to focus the company on other projects and streamline their production. One of those products canceled was the QuickTake camera line, but even though this camera only lived a short 3-year lifespan, Apple wouldn't forget about it. And in 2018, as a bit of a memoriam, they would release a feature on the iPhone called QuickTake, which is a camera app that allowed videos to be recorded without switching out of the still mode. I think the lesson here is how hard it can be to innovate as a company. Apple in the 90s flew a bit too close to the sun with products that, while they were technological achievements ahead of their time, the world was just not ready for, and Apple was not quite ready to make, but they would get there eventually, as we all know.
And we are calling it iPhone.
But in more recent history, a company by the name of Cinemartin would also try to develop their own camera. A cinema camera that was either a scam or just the strangest camera ever made. Was it a scam or was it a real camera? Find out now in this incredibly crazy story.